Special Agent Dominic Washington's hand trembled as he stared down the barrel of Officer Blake Morrison's gun in the crowded grocery store. FBI, he whispered, reaching slowly for his badge. Morrison's face contorted with shock, then something worse, not remorse but rage at being caught. Where are you watching from today? This story of racial injustice and accountability will shake you to your core. Before we dive deeper into this shocking confrontation, hit that like button and subscribe to join our community fighting for justice. What would you do if faced with this kind of discrimination while just trying to do your job? Let's find out how this explosive situation unfolded. The morning had started like any other day for 42-year-old Dominic Washington, a decorated FBI agent with 15 years of distinguished service under his belt. The Atlanta field office had been tracking a sophisticated money laundering operation connected to one of the most dangerous drug cartels in the country for months, and Dominic was their best undercover operative. His assignment that day seemed straightforward: conduct surveillance on the manager of Parkview Grocery, a middle-aged man with a squeaky clean public image who they suspected was a key player in the operation. Dominic had deliberately dressed down in worn jeans, scuffed boots, and a navy hoodie. Nothing that would draw attention in the bustling suburban supermarket. His wedding ring was tucked safely in his pocket, his service weapon concealed but accessible, and a nearly invisible earpiece kept him connected to his surveillance team parked discreetly across the street. The store was crowded with midday shoppers, providing perfect cover as Dominic methodically tracked the manager's movements, noting his interactions with certain employees and specific customers who matched profiles of interest. What Dominic couldn't have anticipated was Officer Blake Morrison's presence. The 38-year-old white police officer wasn't even on duty in this neighborhood, but had stopped by in uniform to pick up lunch. Morrison had a reputation within the department. 6 excessive force complaints in 4 years, all mysteriously buried or dismissed. His fellow officers knew to keep their distance when Morrison was in one of his moods, which seemed increasingly frequent these days. Morrison first noticed Dominic near the pharmacy section, watching the manager speaking with another employee. Something about the black man in the hoodie immediately triggered Morrison's suspicion. Not the careful observation, not the pattern of movement that might suggest surveillance to a trained eye, just the color of his skin and the casual clothing. Morrison abandoned his shopping basket and began following Dominic, hand resting on his holstered weapon. Dominic sensed the tail but assumed it was one of the cartel's security people. When he adjusted his position to get a better view of the manager's interaction with a customer passing an envelope, Morrison made his move. "Hey! You stop right there!" Morrison's voice carried across the store, turning heads immediately. Dominic froze instinctively, maintaining his cover while assessing the new threat. When he saw the uniform, his heart sank. This could blow months of careful work. "Can I help you, officer?" Dominic kept his voice even, hoping to de-escalate without revealing his identity. Morrison closed the distance with aggressive strides. "What are you doing skulking around here? Let me see some ID right now." The confrontation was rapidly drawing attention from shoppers, some already pulling out phones to record. "I'm just shopping, sir. Is there a problem?" Dominic tried again, knowing his backup team would be hearing everything through his mic and would already be moving in. "Don't give me that. I've been watching you watching others. Empty your pockets now." Morrison's hand moved from his holster to his weapon, drawing it partially. Dominic could see the situation spiraling dangerously out of control. If he identified himself now, the entire operation would be compromised, but Morrison's escalating aggression left few options. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding," Dominic began, but Morrison cut him off, fully drawing his weapon now as shoppers gasped and backed away. "Hands where I can see them! Do it now!" Morrison shouted, his finger dangerously close to the trigger. Dominic slowly raised his hands. "I'm reaching for my identification," he said calmly, though his heart pounded in his chest. "FBI," he whispered, hoping to minimize the damage to the operation while preventing a tragic mistake. Morrison's eyes widened momentarily, but instead of backing down, his face twisted with something uglier than surprise. In one fluid motion, he holstered his weapon and lunged forward, grabbing Dominic by his hoodie and violently slamming him against a nearby display of canned goods. The metal shelving cut into Dominic's back as his head snapped back against the structure, sending a shower of cans crashing to the floor and leaving him momentarily dazed. "You think that's funny?" Morrison hissed, his face inches from Dominic's. "Impersonating a federal agent." The impact had caused Dominic's concealed earpiece to dislodge, and he could hear the tinny voice of his team leader asking for status. Blood trickled down the back of his neck from where his head had struck the metal shelf. Through the store's front windows, Dominic could see his backup team already rushing toward the entrance, but it was too late for the operation. Through blurred vision, he spotted the store manager slipping out a back exit along with the customer who had passed the envelope. Months of work destroyed in seconds. Morrison spun Dominic around and roughly cuffed his hands, ignoring his repeated attempts to identify himself. "You have the right to remain silent," Morrison began reciting as the first FBI agents burst through the doors, weapons drawn. "Federal agents, everyone down!" The store erupted in chaos as shoppers screamed and dove for cover. Morrison turned still, gripping Dominic's arm, his face registering shock at the sight of multiple agents with FBI windbreakers closing in with weapons trained on him. "Release the agent now." The command came from Special Agent Teresa Ramirez, Dominic's team leader, her weapon unwavering as she advanced through the scatter of abandoned shopping carts. Morrison's grip on Dominic tightened his mind, struggling to process the rapidly changing situation. "I said release him," Ramirez repeated now, just 15 feet away, 3 more agents fanning out to create a perimeter. The store had emptied of customers in seconds, leaving only employees cowering behind counters and checkout stands. Morrison finally loosened his grip, though his expression remained defiant. "There's been a mistake," he stated flatly, making no move to uncuff Dominic. "I caught this man acting suspiciously." Dominic winced as the cuffs bit into his wrists. "Teresa, our target is escaping through the loading dock." He managed fighting through the throbbing pain in his head. Ramirez gestured to 2 agents who immediately redirected toward the back of the store, though everyone knew it was likely too late. "Keys, now!" Ramirez's tone left no room for argument as she approached Morrison, who reluctantly produced his handcuff key. As Dominic was freed, the store's automatic doors slid open again, admitting Officer Jessica Chen, Morrison's partner, who had been waiting in their patrol car. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene. FBI agents with drawn weapons, her partner isolated, and a black man in civilian clothes bleeding from the head. "Blake? What's happening?" she asked instinctively, reaching toward her holster before thinking better of it. "Your partner assaulted a federal agent conducting an authorized undercover operation," Ramirez informed her coldly. "And he's still refusing to holster his weapon." All eyes returned to Morrison, who indeed still had his hand on his gun despite the multiple weapons trained on him. Slowly, deliberately, he finally secured his weapon. "I was responding to suspicious behavior," he insisted. He didn't identify himself properly. The store manager's office had been quickly converted to a makeshift command center. Store security footage played on a monitor, clearly showing Morrison's unprovoked aggression and Dominic's attempts to de-escalate. An EMT attended to the gash on the back of Dominic's head, applying butterfly closures after determining he likely had a concussion but wouldn't need immediate transport for stitches. The surveillance team's audio recording played from another laptop, confirming Dominic had indeed identified himself as FBI before being assaulted. Officer Chen watched the footage with a hand over her mouth, occasionally glancing at Morrison, who sat stone-faced in a chair refusing to watch. "I've seen enough, declared Assistant Director Eleanor Reeves, a formidable black woman in her 50s who had arrived from the Atlanta field office within 20 minutes of the incident. Her presence indicated the seriousness with which the Bureau was taking the situation. "Agent Washington was conducting authorized surveillance as part of a major federal investigation that your officer has now compromised." The automatic doors slid open again, admitting a tall, gray-haired man in an immaculate uniform adorned with the insignia of a police captain. Thomas Hargrove surveyed the room quickly, his expression grave. "Captain Hargrove," Reeves acknowledged with a curt nod. "Your officer assaulted my agent." Hargrove approached Dominic first, taking in his injuries and disheveled appearance. "Agent Washington, I want to personally apologize for what's happened here. This isn't how my officers are trained to behave." His sincerity seemed genuine, though it did little to ease the tension in the room. He turned to Morrison. "Officer Morrison, you're on administrative leave effective immediately. Surrender your badge and weapon to Officer Chen." Morrison shot to his feet. "Captain, you can't be serious. I was responding to—" "That's an order, officer." Hargrove cut him off sharply. "We'll sort this out at the precinct." Outside news vans were already assembling and the parking lot cameras trained on the entrance. Someone had leaked the confrontation between an FBI agent and local police, and the media had descended like vultures. Dominic's phone buzzed with a text from his wife Aisha. "Are you okay? It's all over the news." Before he could respond, another message appeared. "Elijah and I are on our way." The thought of his 16-year-old son seeing him like this added another layer of humiliation to the entire ordeal. Agent Ramirez approached with an update. "The manager and his contact are in the wind. We've put out an alert, but with our cover blown." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Nearly 8 months of careful work destroyed in an instant. As witness statements were being collected, the narrative became increasingly clear. Multiple shoppers described seeing Morrison aggressively confront Dominic without provocation, escalating the situation despite Dominic's calm responses. Officer Chen pulled Captain Hargrove aside, speaking in hushed tones while occasionally glancing at Morrison. From their body language, it was clear she was sharing information that troubled the captain deeply. The precinct's initial statement, hastily released to the gathering press, was deliberately vague. "The department is investigating an incident involving an officer and a federal agent. We are cooperating fully with federal authorities." Inside, Morrison finally broke his silence, pointing an accusing finger at Dominic. "He should have identified himself immediately and clearly. This is on him." Assistant Director Reeves stepped directly into Morrison's space. "My agent was conducting federal surveillance. Your actions were not only unprofessional, but potentially criminal. Captain Hargrove, I expect your full cooperation with our investigation." As if the situation couldn't get more tense, the doors opened once more to admit Aisha Washington, an elegant woman in a tailored business suit, and Elijah, a lanky teenager whose basketball jersey was visible under his jacket. Aisha's legal background was evident in her composed demeanor as she took in the scene, though her eyes softened with concern when they landed on her husband. Elijah's reaction was less controlled, shock, then anger crossing his features as he saw his father's injuries. Dominic rose painfully to embrace them, whispering reassurances that he was okay despite the evidence to the contrary. As the Washingtons huddled together, the contrast between this decorated FBI agent with his professional wife and honor roll son versus Morrison's allegations couldn't have been starker. Morrison watched the family with an unreadable expression before Officer Chen escorted him out a side entrance away from the waiting media. Social media was already exploding with partial videos of the confrontation captured by shoppers, most starting at the point where Morrison drew his weapon. Without context, they showed a white officer with his gun pointed at an unarmed black man, followed by a violent takedown. The hashtag #ParkViewGrocery was trending within the hour. 2 days after the Parkview grocery incident, Dominic Washington sat at his kitchen table nursing his third cup of coffee despite the doctor's advice to avoid caffeine with his concussion. The blinds were drawn against the news vans that had been parked outside their suburban Atlanta home since yesterday. The pounding in his head matched the persistent chime of his phone as messages from colleagues, friends, and increasingly strangers flooded his inbox. "You should be resting." Aisha said, gently, taking the coffee mug from his hands and replacing it with an ice pack for the swelling that had spread from the back of his head to his right eye. 15 years of exemplary service, 2 director's commendations, and countless successful operations. Yet now the world knew him only as the black FBI agent, assaulted by a white cop. The humiliation burned worse than his physical injuries. Across town at the Atlanta Police Department headquarters, Internal Affairs Investigator Sergeant Raymond Willis was building a very different narrative. "So you're saying you didn't clearly hear Agent Washington identify himself?" Willis led the witness, a store employee who had been restocking near the confrontation. "Well, I heard something, but it wasn't clear," the young man replied hesitantly. Agent Washington was speaking very quietly. Willis nodded encouragingly. "And Officer Morrison was responding to suspicious behavior, correct behavior, that concerned you as well." The employee glanced nervously at the recording device on the table. I guess he was watching people. Behind the two-way mirror, Police Union Representative Martin Brooks nodded approvingly. Later that afternoon, Brooks stood before a bank of microphones outside police headquarters. "Officer Blake Morrison is a decorated 10-year veteran with an exemplary record of service to this community," he declared to the assembled reporters. "He was responding to suspicious behavior as any good officer would. This rush to judgment based on incomplete cell phone videos is exactly why police morale is at an all-time low." Meanwhile, Captain Thomas Hargrove sat uncomfortably in Commissioner Gerald Phillips's office watching the press conference on a muted television. "The FBI is out for blood, Tom," Phillips said, swirling ice in his whiskey despite the early hour. "This could set community relations back a decade if we don't get ahead of it." Hargrove shifted in his seat. "With all due respect, Commissioner, I've reviewed the security footage. Morrison was completely out of line. Washington identified himself as FBI before Morrison assaulted him." Phillips set his glass down with a sharp click. "And that footage needs to stay under wraps while we conduct a thorough investigation. I need you to handle this, Tom. Make it go away." Back at the Washington home, Dominic's phone rang with a call from Assistant Director Reeves. "We've got a problem," she said without preamble. "I've been looking into Morrison's record. 8 excessive force complaints in the past 3 years, all involving minorities, all buried. The most recent was just 2 months ago, excessive force against a black teenager during a traffic stop." Dominic closed his eyes, the pattern all too familiar. "Let me guess, nothing came of it." "Not only that," Reeves continued, "but the complainants often found themselves facing countercharges. Resisting arrest, assaulting an officer. One lost his job, another her housing. This guy has been operating with impunity." Across town, community activist Tasha Robinson addressed a growing crowd gathered outside Parkview Grocery. "This isn't an isolated incident," her voice carried through a megaphone. "This is part of a pattern of harassment and violence against black bodies in our community. We demand accountability." The crowd's chants of "no justice, no peace" carried to Officer Jessica Chen as she sat in her patrol car a block away wrestling with her conscience. She'd worked with Morrison for nearly 2 years and had witnessed his escalating behavior, his comments when no one else was around. She'd told herself it wasn't her place to report a fellow officer. Now she wondered how many incidents could have been prevented if she had spoken up sooner. "Do you believe Officer Morrison should have been immediately fired for his actions?" Comment number 1. If you think the police department should have taken immediate action, or number 2, if you believe in waiting for a full investigation. Has racism affected your own workplace? Hit like and subscribe to join our conversation about accountability and justice. Now, what would happen next as the pressure mounted from all sides? In the Internal Affairs Office, Sergeant Willis discovered Morrison's personnel file had been mysteriously removed from the system. His request for the physical copy was met with vague excuses about a filing system upgrade. When he pressed the issue with his superior, he was reminded that his promotion review was coming up soon. The implication was clear. That evening, investigative reporter Vanessa Carter received an anonymous email containing records of Morrison's previous complaints. The source, listing themselves only as concerned officer, had included body camera footage that had never been made public showing Morrison's aggressive behavior during previous incidents. As Carter began verifying the information preparing a bombshell report, Elijah Washington faced his own battle at Westlake High School. "Your dad should have just complied," taunted a classmate whose father was on the force. "Maybe then he wouldn't have gotten his ass kicked." The resulting fight left both boys suspended, adding to the Washington family's mounting stress. Aisha Washington returned from work early that day to find their front door spray-painted with a crude racial slur. As she scrubbed at the paint, a neighbor cautiously approached. "We installed security cameras last month," the elderly woman said quietly. "They caught who did it. I've already sent the footage to the police." She hesitated before adding, "They were in a police cruiser, Aisha." At FBI headquarters, surveillance photos landed on Assistant Director Reeves's desk, showing Sergeant Willis meeting with Union Rep Brooks and 3 of the Parkview grocery witnesses at a diner outside of town. Their animated conversation required no audio to interpret. Captain Hargrove received the call he'd been dreading from Commissioner Phillips. "It's handled," Phillips said smugly. "Morrison is on administrative leave with full pay while we conduct our internal review. The media will move on to the next controversy by next week." Hargrove gripped the phone tighter. "Gerald, the FBI has evidence of a pattern of behavior. This isn't going away." Phillips's tone hardened. "Then perhaps we need to review whether Agent Washington's actions contributed to the escalation. I hear he has a reputation for being aggressive in his investigations. Maybe this undercover operation wasn't properly authorized." The threat was clear. If the department went down, they'd try to take Dominic with them. Back at the Washington home, Dominic stared at the email from the FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility. Despite being the victim, his judgment during the operation was now under review. Questions were being raised about whether he had followed proper protocols, whether he had adequately identified himself. The message was subtly threatening: back off the Morrison case or face scrutiny of your own career. As night fell, the Washington family gathered in their living room blinds, drawn against the media still camped outside. "What are we going to do?" Aisha asked, the strain of the past 48 hours evident in her voice. Dominic looked at his wife, then at his son, whose suspension notice lay on the coffee table between them. "We're going to fight," he said simply, "because if we don't, nothing changes." But as the Washingtons made their decision, forces were already aligning against them, determined to protect the system at all costs. The question wasn't just whether justice would prevail, but what price the Washington family would pay for pursuing it. 1 week after the Parkview grocery incident, Officer Blake Morrison sat in the wood-paneled office of media consultant Rebecca Sloan, practicing his television talking points for the 3rd time. "Remember, you're the victim here," Sloan coached, adjusting Morrison's tie for the camera. "You were just doing your job in a high-crime area." Morrison nodded, rehearsing his pained expression in the mirror she held up. Hours later, millions of viewers watched as Morrison's eyes, glistening with carefully practiced tears, told a sympathetic interviewer, "I've dedicated my life to protecting this community. Now I'm being vilified because of anti-police sentiment stirred up by the media." The interviewer nodded sympathetically, never challenging Morrison's characterization of Parkview Grocery, located in one of Atlanta's most affluent neighborhoods, as high crime, or questioning why Morrison, who was off duty in that district, had been there at all. In the Atlanta FBI field office, Dominic Washington sat stunned as Assistant Director Reeves outlined the latest development. "They're reopening the Diaz case," she said grimly, referencing a 5-year-old investigation where Dominic's testimony had helped convict a corrupt businessman with powerful connections. "They're claiming you may have withheld exculpatory evidence." Dominic's fist tightened around the stress ball his physical therapist had given him for his still-healing hand injured when Morrison had slammed him into the display. That case was by the book. Every piece of evidence, every witness statement was thoroughly documented and provided to the defense. Reeves nodded. "You and I know that. but they're fishing for anything they can use to discredit you. Across town at police headquarters, Union Representative Martin Brooks filed formal paperwork alleging that Dominic Washington had interfered with a police officer in the performance of his duties. Officer Morrison was responding to suspicious behavior, the complaint stated. Agent Washington's failure to clearly and immediately identify himself created a dangerous situation that Agent Washington then escalated through non-compliance. In his office, Captain Thomas Hargrove stared at the complaint form on his desk. Commissioner Phillips's words echoing in his mind. "Sign it, Tom. Show your support for your officers." Hargrove had built his 30-year career on being a good soldier following the chain of command, but as he lifted his pen, his hand hesitated over the signature line. The security footage he'd reviewed showed no ambiguity. Morrison had been the aggressor from the start, escalating without cause, assaulting a federal agent who had identified himself. Signing this would make him complicit in a lie. At a hastily organized press conference, Commissioner Gerald Phillips stood flanked by community relations officers as he unveiled a new dialogue initiative aimed at rebuilding trust between police and minority communities. No reporters missed the irony that the community most affected by the Parkview incident had no representatives present. This unfortunate incident should not overshadow the excellent work our officers do every day. Phillips declared, refusing to address questions about Morrison's history or the department's handling of previous complaints. In the evidence room at police headquarters, Officer Jessica Chen watched in disbelief as Sergeant Willis removed the original security footage from Parkview Grocery, replacing it with a copy that started several seconds later, eliminating the moment where Dominic had clearly identified himself as FBI. "Chain of custody procedure," Willis explained without meeting her eyes. "This needs to be secured at Internal Affairs." Chen said nothing, but her hand slipped to her pocket where her personal phone had just finished recording the exchange. That evening, Dominic received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end identified himself as James Marshall, one of Morrison's previous victims. "I saw what happened to you on the news," Marshall said, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "Same thing happened to me last year. Morrison stopped me for a broken tail light that wasn't broken. When I questioned him, he dragged me from my car, dislocated my shoulder. I filed a complaint. Next thing I know, I'm facing charges for resisting arrest, and my employer gets an anonymous call claiming I have a drug problem. I lost my job, my apartment, nearly everything." Before Dominic could respond, Marshall continued, "There are others like me. We tried to speak up. Nobody listened." The call ended abruptly, leaving Dominic staring at the phone. Within hours, death threats began flooding the Washington family's various inboxes. "Race traitor," read one message sent to Aisha's work email. "We know where your son goes to school," said another. The FBI quickly arranged protection for the family stationing agents outside their home, but the psychological damage was already done, their sense of safety shattered. Tasha Robinson, the community activist who had been organizing protests, arrived home to find her apartment ransacked, "Stay in your lane," spray-painted across her living room wall. When she reported the break-in, the responding officers took hours to arrive and suggested it was probably just teenagers, despite the targeted message. No fingerprints were taken, no real investigation conducted. In his luxurious Buckhead home, Commissioner Phillips hosted a private dinner for several influential business leaders and the editor-in-chief of Atlanta's largest conservative news outlet. "We need to control the narrative," Phillips explained as servants poured expensive wine. "This Washington character is a loose cannon. His undercover operation endangered public safety." He slid a folder across the table. "Here's everything you need for your exclusive." The next morning the headline read, "Rogue FBI Agent's History of Aggressive Tactics Raises Questions." The article painted Dominic as an agent with a history of bending rules and antagonizing local law enforcement. It quoted anonymous sources close to the investigation, claiming Dominic had failed to follow proper protocols during the Parkview operation. No mention was made of Morrison's history of complaints. Meanwhile, the money laundering investigation that Dominic had been working on hit another dead end. The manager of Parkview Grocery had disappeared along with key evidence. What should have been a career-making case was now in shambles, with millions in drug money still flowing through Atlanta's legitimate businesses. As pressure mounted from all sides, Assistant Director Reeves faced her own battle at FBI headquarters. The Bureau can't afford an open war with local police, her superior warned during a tense video call. We have dozens of joint operations in progress. This needs to be resolved quickly and quietly. Reeves stood her ground. Sir, one of my agents was assaulted while performing his duties. The evidence is clear. Backing down sends a message that our people are expendable. The response was immediate and cold. No one is irreplaceable, Eleanor, not even assistant directors. That night, as Dominic took his turn walking the perimeter of their home, a habit he couldn't break despite the FBI protection outside, he spotted a familiar car driving slowly past. Officer Morrison, supposedly on administrative leave, watching the house with undisguised malice. When Dominic reported the incident, he was told that without evidence, nothing could be done. Morrison wasn't technically violating his leave or any protective order. The system that Morrison had manipulated for years was now working overtime to protect him, while simultaneously closing ranks against the Washingtons. The message was clear: power would protect power, and those who challenged the status quo would find themselves isolated and vulnerable. But what the system failed to recognize was that Dominic Washington hadn't survived 15 years as a black man in federal law enforcement by backing down from a fight, and he wasn't about to start now. 2 weeks after the Parkview Grocery incident, Dominic Washington jolted awake at 3 in the morning, his heart pounding as phantom hands slammed him against metal shelving in his dreams. Beside him, Aisha stirred, but didn't wake, exhaustion finally claiming her after days of hypervigilance. Slipping from bed, Dominic padded to the kitchen, avoiding the windows where FBI protection still maintained their watch outside. The nightmares were getting worse, not better. His therapist had explained it as a classic PTSD response, the humiliation and helplessness he'd felt during Morrison's assault now replaying in his subconscious. During his waking hours, Dominic could rationalize, could focus on fighting back through proper channels, but in sleep his mind betrayed him, replaying those moments of vulnerability on an endless loop. The kettle had just begun to whistle when his secure phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number: Civic Coffee Shop, 6 a.m. Come alone. I can help. J.C. Jessica Chen, Morrison's partner. Dominic stared at the message, weighing the risk. It could be a trap, another attempt to discredit him, or worse, but something in his gut told him this was legitimate. Officer Chen had seemed genuinely horrified by Morrison's actions at the grocery store. 3 hours later, Dominic sat in the back corner of the nearly empty coffee shop, his back to the wall, eyes on the door. He'd slipped his FBI protection detail, something his training made possible, but that would earn him a serious reprimand if discovered. Chen entered precisely at 6, still in uniform, but clearly at the end of a long night shift. Dark circles shadowed her eyes as she slid into the seat across from him, placing a USB drive on the table between them. "I should have done this a long time ago," she said without preamble, her voice barely above a whisper despite the empty cafe. "Morrison's been out of control for years. The things I've seen, the things I've let happen." She pushed the drive toward him. Dashcam footage that was lost from the official record. Body cam video that was edited before being submitted as evidence. Internal emails about burying complaints. She met his eyes directly. "They're trying to destroy the original security footage from Parkview. I made a copy before they could." Dominic didn't reach for the drive immediately. "Why now?" Chen's gaze dropped to her untouched coffee. "My younger brother was arrested last year in a case of mistaken identity. The officers involved treated him like he wasn't even human. I joined the force to make a difference, but I've become part of the problem." Her voice cracked slightly. "What happened to you could have happened to him." As Dominic finally pocketed the drive, his secure phone buzzed again. A text from Aisha. "Call me now." Something in her tone sent ice through his veins. Across town, investigative journalist Vanessa Carter received an anonymous package containing personnel files for a dozen officers, including Morrison. The accompanying note read simply, "These men shouldn't wear the badge." As she began examining the documents, patterns emerged. Multiple excessive force complaints, all involving minority citizens, all mysteriously resolved with no disciplinary action. Even more disturbing were the interconnections. The same supervisors signing off on dismissing complaints, the same union representatives intervening, the same internal affairs officers conducting cursory investigations that went nowhere. Meanwhile, at Atlanta West High School, 16-year-old Elijah Washington was being escorted from chemistry class by two uniformed officers. "What's going on?" he demanded as they led him through hallways filled with staring students. "You're being detained on suspicion of drug possession," the older officer replied, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Anonymous tip." In the school parking lot, Elijah recognized one of the officers from his father's case files, a close friend of Blake Morrison. His heart sank as they made a show of handcuffing him in full view of gathered students before placing him in the back of their patrol car. The subsequent search of his locker yielded exactly what they claimed to be looking for: a small bag of pills planted by the officers themselves. When Dominic arrived at the juvenile detention center 30 minutes later, he found Aisha already in full legal battle mode, her corporate attorney persona replaced by the fierceness of a mother protecting her child. "This is a direct retaliation," she hissed, showing him the arrest report. "Look at the officers' names, both directly connected to Morrison. And this anonymous tip conveniently came in right after you began pushing back against their narrative." Dominic felt something shift inside him as he looked at his son through the glass partition of the holding area. Elijah, honor student and basketball team captain, now wearing an orange jumpsuit, his face a mask of fear poorly hidden behind teenage bravado. This was no longer just about Dominic's professional reputation or even his physical assault. They had targeted his child. The red line had been crossed. "Enough," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "No more playing by their rules." Within hours, Aisha Washington had activated her considerable network of legal connections. As a senior corporate attorney for one of Atlanta's most prestigious firms, she had resources and influence that extended throughout the city's legal community. By nightfall, 3 of the city's top criminal defense attorneys had joined forces to represent Elijah pro bono, recognizing the case for what it was: blatant intimidation of a federal agent's family. In her office at FBI headquarters, Assistant Director Eleanor Reeves received Dominic's call with grim resolve. "They've declared war on my family," he told her, the controlled fury in his voice unmistakable. "I need the full resources of the Bureau behind me now." Reeves didn't hesitate. "You've got it. I'm assigning our public corruption squad to investigate the entire department. We'll coordinate with the Civil Rights Division at Justice. No more kid gloves." Across town, Tasha Robinson addressed the largest gathering of protesters yet, over 5,000 citizens filling the plaza outside police headquarters. "They thought they could silence us," her voice boomed through professional sound equipment donated by local businesses. "They thought they could intimidate us back into submission, but we will not be moved." The crowd roared in response, their signs bearing Dominic's image alongside those of other victims of police misconduct. What had begun as a response to a single incident was rapidly evolving into a movement. Inside police headquarters, Captain Thomas Hargrove sat alone in his office, a tumbler of bourbon on the desk beside a growing stack of internal documents. For 20 minutes, he had been recording himself reading from each paper, detailing dates, times, and signatures of officers involved in covering up Morrison's history and other departmental abuses. When finished, he saved the recording to multiple drives, placing one in his safe and sending another via courier to his attorney. The moral crisis that had been building within him since the Parkview incident had finally reached its resolution. He could no longer be part of a system that would target a child to protect its own corruption. Commissioner Phillips's involvement in the department's rot ran deeper than anyone suspected. As an FBI forensic accountant traced the money from the laundering operation Dominic had been investigating, an unexpected name appeared in the financial records. Phillips's private investment company had received regular payments from shell corporations linked to the drug cartel. His aggressive moves to shut down the investigation suddenly made perfect sense. That evening, despite a restraining order prohibiting him from coming near the Washington family, Blake Morrison parked his personal vehicle a block from their home. His career was circling the drain his wife had left with their children after seeing the unedited footage from Parkview, and he'd begun drinking heavily. In his mind, all his problems stemmed from one source: Dominic Washington. In a moment of alcohol-fueled rage, Morrison approached the house unaware that Dominic's security system was recording his every move. The confrontation on the Washington's front porch was brief but revealing. Morrison, clearly intoxicated, launched into a tirade filled with racial slurs and threats. Dominic, remaining inside the doorway, calmly recorded the entire incident on his phone while FBI agents responded from their surveillance position. Morrison's true character, stripped of professional pretense, was now preserved for all to see. As Morrison was taken into custody for violating the restraining order, news broke that a grand jury was being convened to investigate not just Morrison's assault on Dominic, but the pattern of misconduct throughout the department and potential criminal conspiracy to cover up civil rights violations. On social media, the hashtag #JusticeForWashington began trending nationally, bringing attention to similar cases across the country. The isolated incident at Parkview Grocery had become a flashpoint in the ongoing national conversation about race policing and accountability. For the Washington family, the fight was no longer just about clearing Dominic's name. It had become something larger, a test case for whether the system could truly reform itself when its deepest flaws were exposed to the light. 1 month after the Parkview Grocery incident, the Department of Justice held a press conference that sent shockwaves through Atlanta and police departments nationwide. Today we are announcing a formal pattern or practice investigation into the Atlanta Police Department, declared U.S. Assistant Attorney General Claudia Ramirez, standing before a forest of microphones. Initial evidence suggests systematic violations of citizens' civil rights, particularly those of minority residents. Behind the scenes, the dominoes had begun falling with unexpected speed after Officer Jessica Chen became the first to break the infamous blue wall of silence. Her testimony before the grand jury detailed not just Morrison's history of racial profiling and excessive force, but the departmental culture that protected and even rewarded such behavior. Complaints against certain officers were automatically flagged for special handling. Chen testified, her voice steady despite the career suicide she was committing. Those with connections to the union or the commissioner's office were effectively untouchable. In the days following Chen's testimony, James Marshall, the man who had called Dominic about his own experience with Morrison, found himself in a room with 7 other individuals who had filed complaints against the officer over the years. All had similar stories. Minor or non-existent infractions escalated into violent confrontations, followed by countercharges and various forms of intimidation when they dared to file complaints. Most disturbing were the racial demographics. All 8 complainants were people of color. "He pulled me over for a broken taillight that wasn't broken," recounted Shanice Williams, a 32-year-old nurse. "When I questioned why I'd been stopped, he dragged me from my car claiming I was combative. I spent the night in jail and nearly lost my nursing license." With Attorney General Ramirez's announcement still dominating news cycles, Captain Thomas Hargrove made the most difficult decision of his career. After 3 decades of service, he walked into the U.S. Attorney's office carrying a briefcase full of documents and flash drives. "I can no longer be part of a system that betrays the oath I took to protect and serve," he told prosecutors, laying out evidence of systematic cover-ups stretching back years. His testimony would prove crucial, providing the organizational framework that connected individual incidents into a pattern of deliberate civil rights violations. Do you believe there are more officers like Jessica Chin who witness misconduct but stay silent out of fear? Comment number 1. If you think the blue wall of silence is a major obstacle to police accountability, or number 2, if you believe most officers would report serious misconduct. Have you ever stood up against wrongdoing at great personal cost? Like this video and subscribe to join our conversation about moral courage in difficult situations. What happens when those sworn to uphold the law become the ones breaking it? Commissioner Phillips was in the middle of a press conference defending his department when federal agents appeared at the back of the room. Seeing them, he abruptly cut his remarks short and attempted to exit through a side door, only to find more agents waiting. His planned flight to the Cayman Islands, scheduled for that evening, would never take place. Within hours, evidence emerged connecting Phillips to the very money laundering operation Dominic had been investigating at Parkview Grocery. The commissioner's corruption had extended far beyond covering for problem officers. He had been actively profiting from criminal enterprises operating in his jurisdiction. As Phillips was being processed at the Federal Detention Center, Blake Morrison faced his own reckoning. The police union, which had vigorously defended him initially, withdrew its support as evidence mounted. The Atlanta Police Union is committed to defending officers who serve with integrity, their terse statement read. Recent evidence suggests Officer Morrison's actions fall outside the boundaries of our support. The abrupt abandonment left Morrison without legal representation, just as additional victims came forward with their stories. More devastating personally was the divorce filing delivered to his temporary residence, his wife's petition citing irreconcilable differences. But her accompanying statement to investigators revealing years of domestic abuse hidden behind his badge. He told me no one would believe me over a police officer, she confided to prosecutors finally free to speak. And until now, he was right. Back at FBI headquarters, Dominic's investigation had taken an unexpected turn, connecting Commissioner Phillips directly to the Parkview Grocery money laundering operation. Financial records revealed that Phillips had been receiving regular payments through shell companies linked to the same drug cartel Dominic had been investigating. What had seemed like departmental loyalty protecting Morrison now appeared to be something more sinister. Phillips hadn't just been covering for a problem officer, he had been protecting his own criminal enterprise. The FBI raids on police department offices yielded evidence that stunned even veteran agents. Shredders were found running when agents entered the records division, but significant documentation remained intact, including unofficial performance evaluations for officers like Morrison, who were particularly effective at intimidating residents in neighborhoods where the cartel operated. A series of text messages recovered from Morrison's department-issued phone revealed explicit racial bias with Morrison and several colleagues referring to minority neighborhoods with derogatory terms and joking about using excessive force as attitude adjustments. Most damning was a group chat including Morrison Phillips and several high-ranking officers where they openly discussed targeting specific individuals who had filed complaints or spoken out against department practices. The investigation took another disturbing turn when media outlets uncovered Morrison's connections to an underground white supremacist group that had specifically recruited law enforcement officers. Photos showed Morrison at gatherings where racist ideology was openly promoted, directly contradicting his public claims of fair and unbiased policing. While the investigation expanded, community activist Tasha Robinson found herself working alongside Dominic, connecting victims of police misconduct with legal representation. The unlikely alliance between an FBI agent and a grassroots activist bridged worlds that rarely intersected constructively, creating a model for community law enforcement cooperation based on genuine accountability. Aisha Washington, leveraging her considerable legal experience and connections, formed a coalition of attorneys willing to represent victims pro bono. This isn't just about one incident or one officer. she explained to the assembled legal team. "This is about dismantling a system that has operated with impunity for decades." As the coalition's work gained momentum, Internal Affairs investigator Sergeant Raymond Willis found himself caught in an FBI sting operation recorded while attempting to destroy evidence related to Morrison's previous complaints. His arrest sent another clear message. Those who had enabled the corruption through action or inaction would be held accountable. The walls were closing in from all sides, and as each new piece of evidence emerged, the picture became increasingly clear. What had begun with one officer's racial profiling of an FBI agent had exposed a rot that extended throughout the department, implicating officers, supervisors, union officials, and reaching all the way to the commissioner. For Dominic, who had spent his career upholding the law, the extent of the corruption was staggering. But as he told Aisha late one night as they reviewed case files spread across their dining room table, "Systems don't corrupt themselves. People make choices, thousands of small choices to look the other way, to accept the way things are, to protect those who don't deserve protection. And it takes people making different choices to change things." As the Washington family continued their fight for justice, those different choices were finally being made, not just by officials under federal scrutiny, but by ordinary citizens who had decided that silence was no longer an acceptable response to injustice. 3 months after the Parkview grocery incident, the federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta was surrounded by barricades, police in riot gear, news vans, and hundreds of protesters holding signs demanding justice now. Inside the imposing marble building, Dominic Washington sat in a small preparation room, adjusting his tie for the 3rd time as Aisha gently batted his hands away. "You look fine," she assured him, though the concern in her eyes betrayed her own anxiety. Today would be Dominic's first time seeing Officer Blake Morrison face to face since the assault. Despite months of preparation with federal prosecutors, despite the mountain of evidence against Morrison, despite knowing he had truth on his side, Dominic couldn't quiet the flutter of anxiety in his chest. "What if they believe him?" he asked quietly, voicing the fear that had haunted him since the indictment. Aisha took his hands firmly in hers. "Truth is on our side. Evidence is on our side. And today you get to speak your truth to power." Across the building in another preparation room, Morrison sat with his court-appointed attorney, the police union having withdrawn their legal support as evidence of his misconduct mounted. His once crisp uniform had been replaced by an ill-fitting suit, his confident demeanor by a nervous tic in his left eye. "Remember, we're arguing that you were following department procedure," his attorney reminded him. "You had reasonable suspicion based on Agent Washington's behavior, and you used appropriate force given the circumstances." Morrison nodded mechanically, though both men knew the defense was tissue-thin given the evidence against him. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Mariana Diaz entered her reputation for no-nonsense proceedings preceding her. "The United States versus Blake Morrison," she announced, surveying the packed gallery where the case had drawn national attention. "On charges of deprivation of rights under color of law, assault of a federal officer, and conspiracy against rights." The trial began with the prosecution's opening statement, Assistant U.S. Attorney Marcus Jeffries laying out the case methodically. "This is not just about one incident at a grocery store," he told the jury. "This is about a pattern of behavior by Officer Morrison that reveals a systematic targeting of citizens based on race, a pattern that was enabled and covered up by his department." Morrison's attorney countered with a defense centered on procedure and training. Officer Morrison responded to suspicious behavior as he was trained to do, he argued. "This case is being driven by political pressure and anti-police sentiment, not facts." The prosecution's case built day by day, witness by witness. Security footage from Parkview Grocery played on courtroom screens showing Morrison's aggressive approach, Dominic's calm responses, and the violent takedown that followed Dominic's identification as FBI. Gasps echoed through the courtroom when Morrison could be clearly heard on enhanced audio continuing to escalate after Dominic identified himself. Expert witnesses testified that Morrison had violated multiple departmental procedures, escalating a routine interaction into a physical confrontation without justification. Officer Jessica Chin's testimony created a sensation breaking the blue wall of silence that typically protected officers from accountability. Officer Morrison had a pattern of targeting black and brown citizens for heightened scrutiny and aggressive enforcement. She testified, her voice steady despite the career suicide she was committing. Complaints against him were routinely buried or dismissed. Those who persisted in complaining often found themselves facing countercharges. During cross-examination, Morrison's attorney attempted to paint Chin as disgruntled or biased, but her meticulous documentation of incidents and departmental responses left little room for doubt about her credibility. Captain Thomas Hargrove's testimony the following day was equally damaging, coming from a 30-year veteran with an impeccable record. The department had created a culture where officers like Morrison were protected rather than disciplined, he explained. Complaints were seen as attacks on the department to be defended against, not as opportunities to correct behavior or improve policing. As Hargrove detailed the systematic cover-up of Morrison's previous incidents, the connecting threads between individual cases became impossible to ignore. The human impact of Morrison's pattern of behavior came into sharp focus when several of his previous victims took the stand. James Marshall described being pulled from his car during a routine traffic stop, sustaining a dislocated shoulder when he questioned why he'd been stopped. Shanice Williams recounted being handcuffed so tightly during an arrest that she suffered nerve damage to her wrists, requiring physical therapy to regain full function as a nurse. Marcus Johnson testified about Morrison planting evidence during a stop that led to his wrongful arrest and the loss of his teaching position. Each story built upon the last, revealing not isolated incidents, but a deliberate pattern of targeting minority citizens. When the defense began presenting their case, their witnesses quickly crumbled under cross-examination. Fellow officers who initially supported Morrison's version of events were confronted with their own body camera footage contradicting their testimony. Training officers who claimed Morrison had followed procedure were forced to admit that his actions violated multiple departmental policies. The turning point came when Morrison himself took the stand against his attorney's advice. Initially composed and professional, he maintained that he had been responding to suspicious behavior and had used appropriate force given the circumstances. But under skilled cross-examination by Assistant U.S. Attorney Jeffries, Morrison's facade began to crack. "You testified that you approached Agent Washington because his behavior seemed suspicious," Jeffries began. "Can you explain exactly what about a black man shopping in a grocery store struck you as suspicious?" Morrison shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't about race. He was watching the store manager moving around to keep him in sight. "And did you consider that he might be shopping or perhaps even working as store security?" Jeffries pressed. "Isn't it true that you immediately assumed criminal intent because of his race?" "Absolutely not," Morrison insisted, his voice rising defensively. "I'm not racist. I've arrested people of all races." Jeffries approached with a tablet. "I'd like to enter into evidence Exhibit 42 text messages recovered from the defendant's department-issued phone." As the messages appeared on courtroom screens, a collective gasp rose from the gallery. In conversations with fellow officers, Morrison had used racial slurs and explicitly discussed targeting minority neighborhoods for aggressive enforcement. Most damning was a message sent just weeks before the Parkview incident. "Taught another one a lesson today. These people need to learn their place." When confronted with his own words, Morrison's carefully constructed defense collapsed entirely. His explanation that the messages were just locker room talk rang hollow against the evidence of his actions. By the time Morrison stepped down from the witness stand, his face flushed with barely controlled anger. Even his own attorney appeared to have given up hope for an acquittal. The jury deliberation lasted just 4 hours, remarkably brief for a case of this complexity. As Judge Diaz read the verdict, guilty on all counts, Morrison stood stone-faced while behind him the gallery erupted in a mixture of cheers and sobs of relief from his victims. Outside the courthouse, Dominic addressed the waiting media briefly. "Today isn't a victory," he said, Aisha and Elijah standing supportively at his side. "It's simply what justice should look like every time someone abuses their authority. This case was never about one incident or one officer. It's about a system that needs fundamental change." As sentencing recommendations were filed in the days following the verdict calling for substantial prison time based on the severity of Morrison's offenses and his abuse of authority, the implications of the case rippled outward. Police departments nationwide began reviewing their complaint procedures and accountability measures, aware that the federal government had demonstrated both the will and the means to intervene when patterns of misconduct emerged. In Atlanta, the verdict catalyzed calls for broader police reform, with community groups, legal organizations, and even reform-minded officers joining forces to draft proposals for structural changes to department policies, training, and oversight mechanisms. The case that had begun with a single incident of racial profiling had exposed the deeper institutional failures that allowed such incidents to occur repeatedly without consequence. For Dominic and his family, the verdict brought a measure of vindication, but they knew that true justice would require more than one officer's conviction. It would require the transformation of a system that had protected Morrison and others like him for decades. 6 months after Officer Blake Morrison's conviction, Atlanta awakened to breaking news that sent shockwaves through the city's power structures. The Department of Justice has released its findings following a 6-month investigation into the Atlanta Police Department, announced the solemn-faced news anchor. The report details what investigators call a pattern and practice of civil rights violations, racial discrimination, and systematic cover-ups reaching the highest levels of command. In a downtown conference room, Dominic Washington sat beside Assistant Director Eleanor Reeves as they reviewed the 400-page document that validated everything they had fought to expose. Institutional failures enabled individual misconduct. Read one highlighted section. Department leadership not only failed to address known problems, but actively worked to conceal them from public scrutiny. The report's release coincided with federal indictments against Commissioner Phillips and 5 senior command staff members on charges ranging from obstruction of justice to conspiracy against rights to, in Phillips' case, racketeering related to the money laundering operation Dominic had originally been investigating. The commissioner's arrest at his Buckhead mansion was carried live on local television, the image of the once powerful man being led away in handcuffs, symbolizing the dramatic shift in accountability. "This department will operate under a consent decree effective immediately," announced the U.S. Attorney General at a press conference that afternoon. Federal monitors will oversee comprehensive reforms in training use of force policies, complaint procedures, and accountability measures. For the citizens who had suffered under the previous regime, the announcement represented a seismic shift in power dynamics that many had never expected to see. In a move that surprised many but made perfect sense to those who knew him, Captain Thomas Hargrove, the whistleblower whose testimony had been crucial to the case, was appointed interim commissioner to lead the department through its reformation. "I accept this responsibility with humility and a clear understanding of the work ahead," Hargrove stated at his swearing-in ceremony. "Trust is earned through actions, not words, and we have much to prove to the communities we serve." Among Hargrove's first official acts was establishing a police integrity unit headed by Officer Jessica Chen, now promoted to lieutenant. The unit would have independent authority to investigate misconduct complaints and direct access to the commissioner and federal monitors, bypassing the chain of command that had previously buried such complaints. "We can't undo the harm that's been done," Chen told reporters, "but we can ensure it never happens again." For Dominic Washington, the months following Morrison's conviction had been a period of personal and professional reckoning. The physical injuries from the assault had healed, but the psychological impact lingered. Field operations that once energized him now triggered anxiety. crowded public spaces still made him hypervigilant. After multiple sessions with the Bureau's psychologist, he had begun considering a different role within the FBI. "I've been thinking about that position in training," he told Assistant Director Reeves during a private meeting. "Teaching agents how to recognize and combat bias in law enforcement." Reeves nodded thoughtfully. "You've earned the right to choose your path forward, Dominic. But there's another option I'd like you to consider." She slid a folder across her desk. "We're establishing a new Civil Rights Enforcement Division. The Bureau needs someone who understands these issues from both professional and personal perspectives to lead it." Across town, the Washington family was gradually rebuilding their sense of security. The media vans had finally disappeared from their street, the death threats had ceased, and Elijah had returned to school where the truth about his false arrest had transformed him from a pariah to something of a reluctant hero among his peers. "It's weird," he told his parents over dinner. "Some of the same kids who believed I was dealing drugs are now asking me to speak at their social justice club." Aisha smiled at her son's perceptiveness. "People often follow the prevailing narrative until someone challenges it. That's why speaking truth to power matters so much." Aisha herself had undergone a professional transformation, taking a leave of absence from her corporate law position to lead a coalition of attorneys representing victims of police misconduct. The class action lawsuit they had filed against the department was expected to result in one of the largest civil rights settlements in state history. In the state capitol, legislators were debating a police reform bill that would mandate body cameras, create civilian oversight boards with real authority, establish a statewide database of officer misconduct, and end qualified immunity for officers who violated citizens' rights. The bill faced fierce opposition from police unions and conservative lawmakers, but public opinion had shifted dramatically following the Morrison case and subsequent DOJ investigation. The money laundering investigation that had been compromised by Morrison's actions had resumed with renewed vigor, now expanded to include corrupt police officials who had protected the operation. The trail had led to several prominent business leaders and politicians who had profited from the scheme, creating a widening circle of accountability that crossed racial, economic, and political lines. Tasha Robinson, whose community activism had helped keep public attention focused on the case, received a call from Commissioner Hargrove's office inviting her to serve on a newly formed civilian oversight board with actual disciplinary authority. "They're finally listening," she told her fellow organizers. "Now we need to make sure they hear all the voices that have been silenced." As national media began investigating similar patterns in departments across the country, Atlanta's experience became both a warning and a roadmap. Other communities began demanding the same level of scrutiny and reform, recognizing that what had happened in Atlanta was not an aberration, but a reflection of deeper systemic issues in American policing. For Dominic Washington, standing in his bathroom mirror adjusting his tie before another day of testimony, this time before a congressional committee examining police reform, the journey had come full circle. What began as a moment of humiliation and injustice had catalyzed a movement for accountability that extended far beyond one officer or one department. The system that had protected Morrison for years was being dismantled piece by piece, replaced by structures designed to serve justice rather than shield power. Yet, Dominic harbored no illusions about the fragility of progress or the forces aligned against change. Reform was never a destination, but a continuous process requiring vigilance and courage. As he prepared to once again share his story, he understood that his experience had become something larger than himself, a testament to both the damage caused by unchecked authority and the possibility of genuine transformation when enough people refused to accept injustice as inevitable. 1 year to the day after the Parkview grocery incident, Dominic Washington stood behind a podium in the newly renovated FBI headquarters in downtown Atlanta. A crowd of agents, community leaders, and media representatives filled the conference room as Assistant Director Eleanor Reeves officially announced his appointment as Director of the Bureau's groundbreaking Civil Rights Enforcement Division. Agent Washington's experience and insight make him uniquely qualified to lead this critical initiative, Reeves stated as cameras flashed. His courage in the face of injustice exemplifies the highest ideals of the Bureau. As Dominic stepped to the microphone, he caught the eyes of Aisha and Elijah in the front row, their presence grounding him as it had throughout the tumultuous year. "I accept this position with a profound sense of responsibility," he began. "What happened to me was not unique. The only unusual aspect was that I had the resources and platform to fight back. Countless others have suffered similar injustices in silence." The new division would focus on investigating patterns of misconduct in law enforcement agencies nationwide, working directly with the Department of Justice to implement structural reforms where necessary. Already, departments in 12 cities had been identified for preliminary review based on civilian complaint patterns and use of force statistics. Across town in a federal courtroom, Blake Morrison stood before Judge Mariana Diaz for sentencing. The once proud officer had aged decades in appearance since his conviction, his shoulders slumped in a prison jumpsuit that replaced the uniform he had dishonored. "Mr. Morrison," Judge Diaz addressed him directly, "your actions represent the most egregious abuse of the authority entrusted to law enforcement officers. You targeted citizens based on race, used excessive force without provocation, and betrayed your oath to protect and serve." The sentence, 15 years in federal prison, was unprecedented in the state's history for police misconduct not resulting in death. As Morrison was led away, the gallery remained silent. The moment waited with the recognition that accountability so long denied had finally arrived. The Atlanta Police Department was undergoing a transformation that few would have believed possible a year earlier. Under Commissioner Thomas Hargrove's leadership, with the federal consent decree, providing both mandate and methodology reforms were being implemented that reached every aspect of departmental operations. The changes were more than cosmetic. Use of force incidents had decreased by 38% in the first 6 months. Civilian complaints were being investigated thoroughly rather than dismissed, and community satisfaction with police interactions had shown measurable improvement in independent surveys. Officer Jessica Chen, now Lieutenant Chen, had established the Police Integrity Unit as a model program being studied by departments nationwide. "We're creating a culture where good officers don't fear accountability," she explained during a training session for new recruits. "True integrity means holding ourselves and our colleagues to the highest standards, not closing ranks around misconduct." For the Washington family, life had found a new normal, though one forever altered by their experience. The legal battle had transformed them into reluctant symbols of the movement for police accountability, their names recognized across the country by those fighting similar battles. Dominic's testimony before Congress had directly influenced federal legislation, creating national standards for police conduct and establishing a database to track officer misconduct across jurisdictional lines. The database, preventing officers with histories of abuse from simply moving to new departments, was already being credited with keeping problem officers out of the profession. Aisha Washington's legal coalition had secured historic settlements for Morrison's victims, the funds accompanied by official acknowledgments of wrongdoing and commitments to prevent future abuses. The financial compensation could never fully heal the trauma inflicted, but it represented both justice and the resources for many victims to rebuild lives that had been derailed by Morrison's actions and the system that protected him. Elijah Washington, now a freshman at Howard University, studying criminal justice reform, had founded a national student organization connecting young people affected by police misconduct. "My experience showed me how quickly your life can be upended by a system designed to protect itself rather than serve justice," he told a campus newspaper. "But it also showed me that change is possible when enough people demand it." The money laundering operation that Dominic had originally been investigating at Parkview Grocery had finally been dismantled, revealing corruption extending through multiple levels of government and business. Commissioner Phillips, facing multiple federal charges including racketeering, had agreed to cooperate with prosecutors, his testimony implicating several prominent figures who had previously seemed untouchable. In perhaps the most unexpected development of the year, Dominic received a request from the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Blake Morrison had asked to meet with him as part of a restorative justice program. After considerable reflection and discussions with his family and therapist, Dominic agreed to the meeting, which took place in a prison conference room under careful supervision. "I've had a lot of time to think," Morrison said, unable to meet Dominic's eyes at first. "I can't undo what I did to you or to others. But I want you to know I'm facing it now. The racism I denied for so long, the damage I've caused." The conversation that followed was difficult, honest, and ultimately transformative for both men. While it couldn't erase the past, it represented the possibility of human growth even after grievous failures. The Parkview grocery store where the incident had occurred had been purchased by a community development corporation and transformed into a center focused on building police-community relations, offering meeting spaces, educational programs, and resources for both citizens and officers committed to reform. The symbolism of the location's transformation was lost on no one. As the Washington family gathered in their home that evening to celebrate the anniversary, not of the incident itself, but of their collective decision to fight for justice rather than accept injustice, Dominic reflected on the journey. "When I was lying on that grocery store floor bleeding and humiliated," he told Aisha and Elijah as they shared a quiet dinner, "I couldn't have imagined we'd be here a year later, not just personally healing, but seeing actual systemic change." Aisha squeezed his hand. "Because we refused to be silenced, because enough people finally listened." Elijah, more mature than his years after their ordeal, added, "But it's not over, is it? This is just the beginning." Dominic nodded, recognizing the wisdom in his son's observation. The changes they had helped catalyze were significant but fragile, requiring continued vigilance and commitment to sustain. The forces that had enabled Morrison and protected him for years had not disappeared entirely, but had merely retreated, waiting for public attention to wane and momentum to fade. True justice was never a single verdict or policy change, but an ongoing commitment to creating systems that served all citizens equally. As he looked at his family, Dominic felt both the weight of that continuing responsibility and the strength to carry it forward. Their ordeal had left scars that would never completely fade, but it had also forged them into more effective advocates for the change they wished to see. The journey toward justice never truly ended, but with each step forward, the path became clearer for others to follow. What happened when the system failed that day at Parkview Grocery? It revealed not just individual prejudice, but institutional failure. Has America truly addressed the root causes of racial injustice in policing? Your thoughts matter in this ongoing conversation. Comment below with your experiences or perspectives like this video. If you believe accountability is essential for trust in our institutions, subscribe to join our community, fighting for justice, and share this story as a reminder that change begins when we refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. Thank you for bearing witness to this journey from tragedy to transformation. Remember, in the words of Dr. King, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. But only when we all push it in that direction. The story of Dominic Washington reveals profound truths about justice and accountability in America. First, it demonstrates how racial bias can corrupt even those sworn to protect and serve, turning authority into a weapon against those they perceive as other. Second, it exposes how systems naturally protect themselves, with institutions often valuing reputation over righteousness. Third, it highlights the devastating ripple effects of injustice, touching not just individuals, but families and entire communities. Perhaps most importantly, this story teaches us about the power of moral courage, shown by whistleblowers like Officer Chen and Captain Hargrove, who risked everything to stand for truth. It reminds us that meaningful change requires both individual bravery and collective action. The Washington family's refusal to be silenced, despite intimidation and threats, demonstrates how persistence can transform personal tragedy into systemic reform. Finally, this journey from injustice to accountability shows that while our systems are flawed, they can be reformed when enough people demand better. True justice isn't achieved through a single verdict, but through ongoing vigilance and commitment to creating institutions that serve all citizens equally. Have you ever witnessed injustice and been afraid to speak up? Dominic's story reminds us that change only happens when brave individuals refuse to accept the status quo. Share your thoughts in the comments about a time you stood up for what's right, or what changes you believe are still needed in our justice system. Has racial bias touched your life or community? Let us know by commenting "Justice" if you believe accountability is essential in building trust between communities and law enforcement. Don't forget to like this video if you found this story powerful. Subscribe to our channel for more true stories of courage and transformation, and share this with someone who needs to hear that fighting for justice matters. Thank you for being part of this important conversation. Remember, we create the world we want to live in through our collective actions. Stay strong, stay vigilant, and never stop believing in the possibility of a more just society.